Hello, 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 and welcome back to another episode of Coronacast. Again, no video this week. Like I said, the studio is changing every single day, and so right now I don't have the best background behind me for a video, so they'll come soon. Don't worry about that. And before we get into anything, thank you so much to everyone who has listened, who has reached out, and all of that. Make sure to please go like, subscribe, and rate on the iTunes Store. We're now on Spotify, we're on Google Play, and we are on Stitcher as well as YouTube. So just so many different outlets you can listen to the show from, and we're just trying to build the audience here, and so far gotten a lot of great reactions. And continue to listen, continue to let me know what you're thinking. If you have any guest ideas or if you have any topic ideas, let me know. And again, thank you to everyone that has reached out. So today, I wanted to make sure that this show goes global and we don't just focus on what's happening in the United States. So I have brought on my good friend Alex Sivolella, who is from Brazil. I met him in my my graduate program, the Vinix Sports Entertainment Management program at the University of South Florida. And Alex and I have just always been very close since we started in that program. And so, Alex, thank you so much for being on today. How are you doing down there in Tampa?
Thank you for having me, Josh. It's been closing, like everything, staying at home, trying to get out just like for groceries. It's been a bit calm.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to panic like most people, I think.
Yeah, that's the hard part. And Florida, obviously, as I had mentioned a little bit on this podcast, was one of the last places to actually have a shelter-in-place order issued out of any state. And so it's been a little bit different here in Denver than it was when I left Tampa. But now it seems every state except North Dakota is on board. And so, wherever you are, you're probably staying there for a little bit. So what I wanted to bring Alex on today, though, to talk about is what's going on in Brazil. And if you've been following the geopolitical landscape at all, you'll know that Brazil has been an outlier in how they've responded to coronavirus. They've been an outlier in how the president and how the government is viewing coronavirus. And so I just wanted to get Alex's thoughts so we can kind of understand what's going on in another major country besides the United States. So Alex, before we dive into anything, tell us a little bit about your background, how long you lived in Brazil before you moved to the United States, what kind of degrees and everything like that you have. So if you wouldn't mind just jumping into a little bit of your background, we'd love to hear it.
So, born and raised in Rio. Most of my life in Rio, I lived close to downtown in the neighborhoods of Gloria and Flamengo. This is an area close to the bay. So you have the Rio that faces the Atlantic Ocean, and you have the Rio in the back, in the north, and you have the people who live close to the bay, basically, and the city is spreading out to the west, where you can find like residential complexes like the ones you find in Florida sometimes. And I used to live close to downtown, so my childhood was pretty much like very urban. I loved like walking the streets, seeing the ancient churches and people moving around. I'm really a urban person, but I also love, of course, here in Florida, the nature and the opulence of like having birds and animals and everything. But maybe I like it now because I was so much immersed in the city. And I was law, and I had degrees in law and film. When I was just a kid, like my dream was to become a diplomat. So I think my parents kind of influenced me because they were working for a development bank, and in the beginning especially, most of their work was traveling around the country to like make sure the projects that the bank was involved in were being conducted properly. So I remember seeing photos of them in, like, for example, in a canoe in the Amazon River, things like that. Not the Amazon River itself, but some other river in the region, in the basin. So I remember like keeping memories of places that I wanted to go to, and very soon I started like learning other languages. My first foreign language was French, for example, because the school where I was Benedictine order so they were very strict. And French and classical, like classic literature, we were studying that at the fourth, fifth year. But then becoming a diplomat for many people means to study law, and that's why I went to law school. I was like a fish out of the ocean because I felt not exactly as I wanted, like I was dreaming about college life. It was good, like learning everything, especially the foundation courses. But then, even before I finished, I was doing some courses in the communications department, and they had like introduction to the movies, to like film, Latin American film, Brazilian documentary, things like that. And I started like going like a crazy in the middle of the people who were like studying journalism, literature, and other stuff. And I felt like alive again because I don't know, I was discussing, and most of all, I think I was finding out how like the movies, film, TV shows, anything that is audio with visual carries a like a specific vocabulary, a specific is a different language. So I think it's pretty much what people who like study like mathematics or literature, like different things in different areas, but they kind of convert into some way that you can look at society and at history and like, decode it somehow, I think.
Yeah, a little off topic, but just through our conversations and getting to know you, you've really changed the way I look at films, the way I've looked at commercials and different things. You've kind of added that societal element of how I view those things, which has been really interesting for me to learn. And, you know, you're one of the most informed people on films that I've ever met. So clearly that's been a good background for you. And then after all of that, when did you move to the United States? Did you move here before you entered the program in 2018, or did you move to the U.S. at that time?
Yeah, it was a year before. So after film school, I created a company. We worked over 10 years doing a lot of stuff, and I started working with some American companies like Facebook. I did two videos for them. And so I came to San Francisco. I have friends who live in California, especially in San Francisco, and I loved so much everything about it. Like it was like some sort of discover that you find out that you are related emotionally or I don't know to some place. And so I wanted to see more. I wanted much more than see. I wanted to feel it. So I started thinking about, oh, maybe I should like apply for an MBA program, or in the beginning I didn't know if I wanted to go after an MFA program. I started researching, and then it's when I think like the bell tolled because I found out that I wanted to study sports because sports, like the audiovisual is intrinsically in sports, but sports, differently from the movies even, I think, is much more powerful attracting the identification of the fan.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, I love Star Wars, I love like Baby Yoda, but like cheering for a soccer team or for a football team is completely different. It's much more cathartic.
Yeah.
So
and part of that too,
I wanted
think,
to learn about that cathartic feeling.
Yeah.
You know.
And a huge part of that too, I think, is because sports are live. Whereas if you're going to see Star Wars or Harry Potter or one of those, you know, really huge fan films, it still was pre-filmed, and even the opening night isn't the same thing as being at, you know, a single sports game. And so, yeah, I totally understand you with that cathartic feeling around sports.
Yeah.
And
exactly what you pointed out, like the experience is like nothing else, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember when I was a kid, not a kid, I was like 16, and it was the first time that I, like almost as an adult, I was experiencing my team, which is Fluminense from Rio, like becoming champions of something important again, like 21 years after the last time. And oh my God, I never felt like that.
Yeah.
Like out of a stadium, I think.
Yeah, it's so cool, those first couple of experiences you have at a sporting event that are like nothing else. Like for me, I remember the first Broncos playoff game that I went to, Denver Broncos, and just, you know, that energy there and all the fans cheering at the same time and all of that. It's so different than anything else. So Before we go too far down the sports rabbit hole, which we could obviously talk about for hours and hours, how much family do you still have left in Rio? I know your parents are kind of world travelers, but are they back in Brazil now? And then is most of your kind of extended family in Brazil as well?
Yeah, so my parents are stranded in their apartment, and that is making them very nervous, I think. They are not used to be like caged birds, and it's hard. I have an aunt and an uncle living in Rio from my mother's side, and two aunts living also in Rio from my father's side.
Mm-hmm.
And I have around like 6 or 7 cousins, and pretty much that's it. Like, I don't have any grandparents. I think I would be much, much more worried if I had.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so the thing is, my parents, they are kind of skeptical about the pandemic concept. So what makes me even more distressed about this is knowing that they would like face the possible consequences of going in the street, because I think they don't. They at the same time they were in the Far East in the beginning of the year when everything was coming up in Wuhan, and they were in Singapore, for example, at that same time. So I was really worried because we didn't know the exact reach of the COVID-19. We were aware that it could come, and it would probably come. The question was when, right?
Mm-hmm.
As you said, like before. And so, but at the same time, of course, they are living like comfortable lives. And for them, I don't worry about things like how the economy is now going really down, and some people are losing their jobs. And if they don't have any money, like they need some support.
Mm-hmm.
But fortunately, my family doesn't have that issue.
Yeah, we're both very lucky that we have families that, are at least well within their means in terms of not having to worry about losing a home or not having food on the table. We're super fortunate for that. But just kind of a broad overview and kind of a little bit more of a broad overview of maybe some of your parents' skepticism. Go into a little bit of the history of coronavirus in Brazil. I continue, and everyone knows on here, I continue talking about March 11th as the day that the virus really came to the United States. That was the day that sports were suspended and all of that stuff, and nobody had any idea what was going on. Was it about that time or a little bit later that the attitude in Brazil really turned towards, coronavirus is going to be something here?
So it was 2 weeks after that.
Okay.
I remember I was here in Tampa with you, and that's when we really like understood the whole scope of what was happening. And at the same time, people in Rio were celebrating like the ashes of Carnival. Mm-hmm. They were getting to the streets to work, to wherever they wanted to go. And it seemed that COVID-19 for Brazilians 4 weeks ago, like a month ago, was something that was happening elsewhere and would not come to us like a pandemic like people saw in the beginning of the 20th century. So people were skeptical because they were not seeing that like in the streets, like mm-hmm. people saw in Italy, what happens when you don't have enough resources to take care of people, right?
Absolutely. And just real quick, so Carnival, which is like a Mardi Gras on steroids in Brazil, when does that take place?
So it changes year after year because it follows the religious calendar.
Okay.
But it's usually in February.
Okay.
Sometimes in March.
Okay.
And so this year was in February. And people, usually it's funny because it's not just the 5 days, depending on the city you are. People are so much more festive that they go to the streets like a month before and maybe like half a month after it happened. Mm-hmm. So it was extended. I think Mardi Gras is like that now too, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, and it's interesting because we've talked about in the United States, we talked about Mardi Gras being a potential reason that the number of cases are so high in Louisiana. I wonder if Carnival had a very similar effect in the Brazilian population, in the sense that so many people are so close to each other that even one person has it, it's just going to spread like wildfire. So you kind of talked about, within the last couple of weeks, it's gotten pretty, big, and as far as like Brazilians noticing about it. Go into a little bit of a response about your president, because for those people who don't know, the Brazilian president is, a really far right extremist kind of guy, way worse than Trump on a lot of things. And, just go into him and his response with coronavirus a little bit.
Yes, so Bolsonaro, it's funny because there's a fun fact about it. In February, in fact, in January, they were here in the U.S. visiting the U.S. president and some members of the cabinet. And it seems there was a party to celebrate someone's birthday. And they like touched each other and they were like celebrating, drinking together. And when they got back to Brazil, of I think 30 some people, half of them were with the virus. And that could be even like a source of how the contamination spread out in like some parts of Brazil, like Brasilia or Rio. I know the main cases in February came from people who were visiting Italy as tourists. And they went to Rio and to São Paulo. And São Paulo, which is now like the biggest spot for coronavirus cases in Brazil, with almost half of the cases. And in terms of death, the same thing. People who were in Italy brought the virus, and because of like family parties and events like that, the virus found way like to contaminate other people and spread out.
Mm-hmm. And some people may have remembered was it mid-March? I remember it was mid-March where there was that concern that Trump might have coronavirus because Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, had tested positive for it. So that was a bit of a headline here in the United States. But when Bolsonaro went back to Brazil, why did he have so much kind of anti-coronavirus prepping and things like that? I mean, a lot of people there kind of think it's a hoax or are not worried about it. Why has Brazil been so adamant about really not going after the root of the problem in the way that other countries have?
Yeah, it's funny because Bolsonaro, he doesn't belong like to a party that was consolidated over time. It was very much casual that he was taken to PSL, which translates to social liberals. But it's like a rent party. It's not exactly a party with an ideology. And he got elected because he antagonized everything that the Workers' Party did for 13 years when they elected Lula and Dilma. Dilma got impeached after massive protests in Brazil from 2013 to 2016. And I think that because people, artists, members of civil society, people in general seen from the left, started like asking the governments at the city, the state, and the federal level to create some sort of lockdown to try to impeach, like the way the virus was spreading without control and without proper preparation, which I think it's much worse. And the Bolsonaro government, I think they thought their idea is if we let the virus become a real problem, the appreciation of the voters might drop like significantly. So I think they are betting that the virus will not have the kind of effect it had in other countries like in Europe. So he can profit politically from like being the guy who was choosing a different path than the whole rest of the world, So yeah, I think he's betting on that.
Yeah, that's a big gamble, and we kind of saw something similar with what Boris Johnson wanted to do in the UK was, they call it that herd immunity, where if enough people get affected with the virus, then enough people become immune to it. But we've seen in that time since the herd immunity kind of rhetoric out of England that they have now locked down the country. So do you think a lockdown like that type of style is coming to Brazil? And assuming that Brazil doesn't have the kind of healthcare infrastructure that even a European country or America has, what if this, gamble he's taking doesn't pay off? Is Brazil prepared to handle the type of pandemics or the type of cases that are happening in, say, New York City right now?
Yeah, it's a good question because it raises our attention to some issues that are happening in Brazil. They are probably changing the face of the country, I think. Usually, the exercise of political power in Brazil was very authoritarian, like in the 30s, in the last century. We had a dictator. We had another dictatorship in the 70s. So I think like people see presidents as some sort of like monarchs that govern the country. And we have a structure. There is a national health system called the SUS, S-U-S. It was inspired by what happens in Canada and the UK with the national health systems over there. And it works pretty well if you think like it reaches the whole territory, but at the same time, it's not capable of handling the demand that the people need, especially if you think that almost 50% of Brazilians don't have proper sanitation, for example. So Brazil has to deal with like tropical diseases that don't necessarily profit from being at those latitudes, but from a government that doesn't effectively reach 100% of its citizens with like the basic needs, right? Mm-hmm. So the thing about like changing the face of the country that I said, it's because before you had the authoritarian idea, and now you have like the governments of the states starting to have some kind of independency, if not just rhetorically speaking, but for acts that they order in disagreement with what the president is ordering. So, for example, you have the governor of São Paulo, which is a guy who came from the entrepreneurial area, let's say, who praises like liberalism and like the laissez-faire of the economy and also the rights to like some sort of subsidies to the national companies. João Doria, it's his name. Mm-hmm. And there are some fascinating stories about him in supposedly sex videotapes that like were in online and everything. So he's very in disagreement with Bolsonaro now. So he was asking people to stay at home, and he even mentioned the possibility of a lockdown in the city of São Paulo if necessary. So the governors of the main states, they started creating some makeshift hospitals in stadiums, for example. So the Maracanã Stadium and some stadiums in São Paulo are receiving the army to organize like some hospitals and I think in some cases it's not exactly for people with COVID, but in some cases it's for the people who don't have the COVID, so you can release hospital beds for like specifically for COVID patients, right?
Mm-hmm. And we've seen that in America with like the USNS Mercy that's docked in New York, where they're putting no COVID patients on the ship. It's just 1,000 beds for non-COVID patients. What I did want to ask you, though, was how have these, do you call them governors or ambassadors or whoever runs the state within Brazil, how has, when they've taken kind of an opposite direction of what Bolsonaro has recommended, how have they been received by Bolsonaro? Is he kind of now maybe, limiting aid, or have we gotten to that point at all? Or has there been any backlash? What's going on in that realm?
Yeah, he threatened to like make the aid less in terms of equipment, materials, money to the states. So the states started to organize themselves. We have a whole Northeast region, for example, with 9 states. And 9 of those states are governed by opposition governors, and they kind of created like some sort of group to make bids and try to buy like proper EP materials for doctors and nurses and first responders independently from the federal government. In some parts of the country, there are 3 states that are totally in agreement with Bolsonaro. 27 states of Brazil, 24 are taking measures differently from the effort by the federal government not to put people like to stay at home and trying to contain the spread. They are trying to exactly the opposite, make people go back to the streets, back to work, because I think they are, of course, like worried with how the consequences for the economy will be in the near future. And instead of just like criticizing them for sometimes saying stupid things, I think if we at least give some time to think like how people are going to suffer the consequences of the COVID outbreak in Rio, for example, in the favelas, the federal government promised, and I think it's taking place exactly now, support of 600 Brazilian reais, which translates to $150, I think, or even less now. The exchange rate has been crazy the last days. So they're giving this money to each person, so a family would have like $300 extra to buy groceries or whatever they need. But of course, it's not enough. It's not enough in any country. And I don't know exactly how Brazil is going to have to deal with people needing more financial support if this takes longer.
And one thing that you did bring up that I really wanted to talk about was the favelas in Rio and São Paulo and around the country. What is typically the health care for people who live in the favelas without the COVID outbreak? Is it usually pretty poor? Are they usually able to go to a hospital? Or what has typically, just kind of from your experience, been for their health care without the COVID living in a favela?
Yeah, usually in Rio, where favelas became famous as sort of suburban, highly dense area with very low availability of proper sanitation, water supply, energy, like electric energy supply and everything. And in some cases, you don't even have like a space to build a hospital because there is no land available. In some like bigger favelas and more old favelas in close to downtown Rio, you would find like some sort of clinic close to the favela. But in most cases, if you need like more like an emergency or even an urgency kind of support, you would have to go to a major hospital. There is like a network of some dozens of hospitals, public hospitals in the city of Rio, in the metropolitan area, run by both the city government and the state government. But I just read that they are running with 80% of hospital beds occupied by just people who have COVID.
Wow.
So in 2 weeks, we are going to have the same kind of stuff the U.S. is going through right now in the next week.
And with those
just
favelas,
20%.
Yeah, wow. I didn't even know that. That is going to be, it's going to be a tough couple of weeks there in Brazil. With the favelas as well, do they have ambulances that go into the favelas, or are patients typically required to get to their hospital on their own if they're sick and injured in the favelas?
Yeah, some favelas are located in very steep hills. So you can find like main streets crossing some blocks, and sometimes to get to a specific place, like a specific house or apartment, even sometimes there are apartment buildings in the favelas, and you need like people to give some help to like carry up like a person or something and get to the main street where the ambulance was like waiting for them. And this is one of the issues you have when like 1/3 of the Rio residents live in a favela. It's like more than a million and a half people, I think. We are talking about a 7 million city, a city of 7 million people. And it's one of the places in Brazil where you can witness what being like a country under very strict restrictions because it's developing itself, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not taking care of like 100% of the population.
Mm-hmm.
Education, public education, lacks support, lacks money from the government. It's hard in some areas because of violence, even for hospitals. For example, I was reading that in some favelas in Rio, the drug trafficking people, the gangs, they were telling people on WhatsApp and through speakers in the communities for people to stay at home because if the government is not capable of dealing with the crisis, the organized crime will have to deal with that. So it's pretty crazy.
Yeah, that's one thing that does really concern me about what could happen in the favelas is that all of these people get sick with COVID. You are, knocked out within 24, 48 hours. And then all of a sudden the ambulances can't get in there and these people can't be transported. And so, out of anywhere in the city, the favelas, the COVID could spread like wildfire very easily. So that's got to be a big concern to, state officials and people who live there right now.
Yeah.
That'll be
Think
really
about
interesting.
this. In a favela, for example, my parents live in a neighborhood called San Conrado, like Saint Conrad,
Mm-hmm.
and it's close to like less than a kilometer where the Rocinha is. Rocinha is the most famous and the biggest favela in Rio,
Mm.
with about 70,000 residents. And with some commerce, they have banks in the low part. It's of course it's more difficult, and the houses are worse in terms of conditions if you go up the hill.
Mm.
Um, so there is a market for real estate and everything in this area. It's big. It has like it's developed much more than other areas. And but sometimes we are talking about houses with just like one room, with probably like 400 square feet, 500 square feet, where six people are living together.
Wow.
And people don't breathe like well enough to keep themselves safe and healthy. And it's not rare that you have tuberculosis outbreaks in Rocinha because of how close the houses are and how low the wind circulates among the houses, the edifications.
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty wild if you think that people were being treated that way, very so close to other where others are living like a, I don't know, a middle class life.
Yeah. Oh man, I can't. Yeah, that's gonna just. Oh my goodness, you could be in a lot of trouble there in Brazil, especially with people that close on top of each other. I mean, that's really a phenomenon that we don't have here in America, thankfully. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with all of that over the next couple of weeks. I did want to take a look at your view moving forward, and kind of what you think happens, especially with the response from the federal government. How long do you think that this takes for Brazil to get out of? I mean, obviously they're kind of entering their winter right now, not that you have a real official winter in Brazil, but what are you kind of thinking and speculating as far as what happens in the long term over the next couple weeks and months there?
So I think another way of how Bolsonaro is gambling with the COVID-19 situation is that Brazil is getting to like another season now. And the temperatures will not go so low in some areas, but in the south, in São Paulo, it can get pretty chill in the evening. And I think he bets on how the temperature will help him contain the virus in some areas. The stay-at-home orders that we have now are going pretty much more of them are going through the whole month of April.
Mm-hmm.
So people think that in May, by mid-May, maybe we start to get like back to like working, going to the streets, sharing the public transportation with other people and everything. But people will be, I don't think people will be comfortable enough like to get back to real like normal life like before.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly if we're going to see the same kind of phenomena everywhere, but I imagine that people are going to have some changes in the habits we have. Brazilians are very much touchy. Like we touch each other all the time, we hug, we kiss, and this is exactly one of the ways the virus spreads out. So I'm curious about the kind of new cultural changes that we are going to see in some countries like Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Are you concerned that Brazil will have an overload of cases and an overwhelming amount of cases similar to Italy or New York or London? Are you concerned about that right now?
So there is a guy, he's a biologist specialized in microbiology. His name is Attila Yamarino. So this guy's from São Paulo. He's like an influencer on YouTube. A lot of people watch his videos talking about science. And he was at the most important talk show, not a talk show, like a round table of discussions on TV 2 weeks ago. And he was mentioning that the studies people were conducting were saying that probably 1 million Brazilians could get the virus. And the percentage of people who die would be comparable. So I think that kind of message got people's attention, and people started to like be really concerned with how the government was dealing with the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have 14,000 and a half cases in Brazil and 720 deaths, but it's increasing pretty fast.
Mm-hmm.
I hope, of course, I hope that not so many people die because of this. I hope that the makeshift hospitals they are putting up everywhere like work, and especially that the people who are responding to everything have like the proper equipment and materials to work with.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that I don't think we are going to have like 1 million people. Like for everything that I've read, and I'm not like an expert in any of those fields, but I think we are going to have something like what the U.S. has now,
Mm-hmm.
like 400,000 people. I think we are going in between that and 1 million.
Yeah, and Brazil's obviously a very big country, so you could have it be very localized and that be a majority of the cases, such as in Sao Paulo or Rio, and not necessarily have it be out in the countryside in places like that. And so, yeah, we'll definitely be keeping an eye on what Brazil does, and hopefully with the reaction from, a president who is in true denial about what's actually happening in his country, hopefully that his impatience or his, his inability to govern in this situation does not backfire and lead to many deaths and many illnesses in Brazil, but only time will tell. So the last thing I've been ending my interviews with, and this doesn't necessarily have to be about Brazil at all, but just what are some silver linings that you think come from the coronavirus pandemic? People have talked about, getting closer with their families. People have talked about realizing what's important. Do you have anything that you're just kind of maybe predicting or speculating at this point is a silver lining from this whole pandemic? It can be for you as a person. It can be, societally, however you think about it.
Yeah, I was watching TikTok before talking to you, and there were some videos of people, like, for example, tennis players who cannot go to the courts. So they are like playing, quote unquote, on TikTok, like passing the ball to someone else. So co-creating content, like social media is perfect for that, especially with our smartphones and everything. So I think the silver lining for this whole crisis, this whole staying at home thing, home offices and people who are not, some people are, of course, we have more fights among the couples and family issues, of course, increasing during this crisis. But I think in terms of like content creation for people who are interested, I think we are going to have something new, some sort of user-generated content collectively, really collectively working together to create some new sorts of content. I was watching some good news, the videos that they were creating. Yeah, exactly. I was looking for his name then. So Krasinski, he's funny. He's like a nice guy, and he has relations in the industry. So it was pretty fun to see like Robert De Niro being the weather guy.
Mm-hmm.
I loved it.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of, and they don't need like a fancy camera to have him on like in the image. And I don't know, the video was fun. It felt like it was some sort of low budget HBO program.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about what people are going to create in the future, and especially about the kind of technologies, biotechnologies that we're going to have to face a new like pandemic.
Absolutely.
Because I don't think this is the only pandemic we're going to see in our like lifetime.
No, unfortunately, I think you're right on that. As far as we'll probably see another pandemic, but yeah, from your perspective as a content creator and being in that space, I do think it's interesting to see what comes from this. And so many people have so much. Everybody has a voice, and we've known that for a while. But everybody now has a voice to create some sort of meaningful content. And I think a lot of stars and a lot of people who are really could influence the future could be discovered from this time and that sort of creation. So yeah, that's a really good silver lining, and not one that I would have thought of from this. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us today. It is really interesting to learn about what's going on in another country, and especially a country that's responded in the way that Brazil has. So thank you so much for your time. Hopefully we can get you on here again, and enjoy the rest of your shelter in place.
Thank you, Josh. Hope to see you in person once again.
Yes, sometime soon, hopefully. And thank you so much for everyone who listened. Please remember to like, subscribe, follow on all the different platforms. If you have any questions, just reach out to me on social media or my email at josh@joshvancoten.com. That's right, I do have my own website. In today's day and age, you got to have your own website, or what else are you doing? So, but with that, I'll leave you there. And until next time, I'll see you on the other side.